Twilight stood in the living room of the Apple family home, blinking and looking around for a sudden confusion. It was exactly as she had seen it last. A cozy circle of a farmhouse furniture, heavily worn by many times patched on all sturdy rug on the color of autumn leaves, shelves and tables, cluttered around the walls papered in warm tones, and plain yet homey patterns, paintings and photos representing 4 generations, tastes and sensibilities hung nearly on every surface, and all of it bound together by the solid ribs of the house. On the wooden posts, beams, and floors, all stained with rich cherry that shone almost crimson in the gentle light. In the corner Juana laid curled up in a small straw bed, gawing on a long thin bone between the soft, curiously plaintive whines. The room was almost overwhelming with its clarity and detail, and it took Twilight a moment to realize she wasn't having any trouble focusing on any of it. Gone was the blurry, washed out of impression she had of the outside world. In contrast, this was nearly as bewildering. There wasn't as an inch of the room that wasn't in perfect focus at all times. She could perceive details ranging from minute grains worn into individual boards to the spacing between the threads on the quilts and cushions. It was as if she stepped on into a theater and had been blinded, not by the sun, but a projection, a melange of information, pushed up on her and overwhelming her senses with the plain-stalking charity. It was so much to take in that she hadn't noticed the humming voice right away. As soon as she did, though, she wondered how she could have missed it. It was unmistakably Applejack's voice, and she sounded, to Twilight's surprise, both happy and content. Applejack? No one answered, nor was there any change or pause in the wordless tune issuing from the kitchen. Twilight stepped forward, and was momentarily surprised that she could walk so easily. She had, for some reason, expected to be limping, or have trouble keeping her hooves in line, or some such. But why she had expected that? Oh well, it didn't seem important. She followed the sound of her friend's voice, the walls and the floor of the house sliding past her as if on rails. She felt oddly distant from herself, like she was an audience to her own perspective. Removed yet still behind her own eyes. What an odd sensation. She stepped through the door to the kitchen. There was Applejack, standing at the stove with her back turned to Twilight, humming that strange, tuneless, yet pleasing melody while she worked on something at the cooktop with her forehooves. In between them was the kitchen table and oh, Celestia, what a table! Twilight's eyes went wide at the sight of it. Whether it was from hunger or simply to take in all the myriad colors and textures, couldn't have said. There were fritters and pies, a simple pumpkin stuffed overflowing with boutiques, and orange and gold mums and sunflowers. The entire ring of vibrant winter squash varieties, sliced and presented, baskets of rolls swollen to bursting beneath the crowns of butter, dishes of lettuce and kale tossed in glistening dressing with the bright points of radishes, and mounds of glowing golden corn, grilled and dripping with butter, paprika, cayenne, and black pepper, that Twilight could smell even from where she stood. She felt weak with the yearning, and felt a pain of hunger rose up inside her, stronger than she ever thought she was capable of feeling. But stronger even than all of this is what drew her eye to the left side of the room. The water pump over the sink, and the clear, silver drops of water that was even then the falling lazily from its spout. "Twilight!" Applejack exclaimed, her cocking hat ever so slightly as she heard Twilight approach. "I thought I heard you. Think Celestia you're back safe and sound. I hope you've got an appetite. We fixed you something as real nice as our way of thanking you." Applejack waved a hoof, gesturing to the room as she worked on a spoon through the dishes on the stove. Y'all go ahead and get started. Whatever suits your fancy, it's yours. Anything such for a good pony. Twilight didn't hesitate a moment longer. With a single flap of her wings, she was at the sink, glass and hoof straining against the pump with all her might. It took only one firm push, and water, sweet, clear, icy water, gushed out of the tap, spraying so hard it drenched Twilight's hoof as she tried to fill the glass. She threw the cup back and drained it in the long pole, barely breathing, and she stuck it back for another fill. It was another strange for water, possessing a surprise substance and weight. It felt almost thick, in the oddest of ways, as it dribbled from her lips down to her chin. But no matter what, her thirst overpowered all of her thoughts. She downed another glass and then a third, before she finally set the glass aside and stuck her head under the pump, but wrapping all of her lips around the spout as she drained for more. The pump seemed to be running dry, and the pipe shook and heaved as she forced more water through it. The liquid gargled and spluttered, coming slower and slower until Twilight was practically sucking it out of the nozzle. She fell back, panting out of breath. Oh, that was so good! When she had a sample of water taste so good, so rich. She glanced over at Applejack, suddenly a sheepish lack of manners she had displayed, but Applejack was gone, apparently having left while Twilight would have been drinking. Perhaps she's gone to the cellar or the pantry to fetch something, and what remained there was the food. Twilight paused for the briefest moment, thinking that surely she ought to wait for Applejack or the others. It would be rude beyond imagining to start digging into such wondrous feast without even waiting for those that had prepared it. And there was something else, something nagging at the edge of her attention, insisting she wait, insisting she leave that even, and that she shouldn't touch the food or for some reason. But Applejack had invited her. The smell was positively overpowering, a medley of smoky spices and salt and sugar, and something else, something she couldn't quite put her hoof on it beneath it all. That made her think of the texture of hair and skin beneath teeth. She recoiled again, feeling more uncertain than ever. But why would that be? This was Applejack's home. The ponies who had given her first of food as a guest to be every day when she arrived at Ponyville. Nothing they served would ever be anything but the absolute finest, if a bit simplistic for some ponies' tastes, maybe. Ponyville. The name jarred into something in her mind. Where was Ponyville? Outside, silly. Down the path. Twilight frowned, her ear twitching. It had been her own thought. It sounded like her voice, although... What am I waiting for? She asked herself. She was asking herself. She was sure of it. All this food is being given to me. It would be rude not to take it. All part of the cycle, after all. A pony needs to eat. The light from the lamps on the table flickered, dancing over the glossy, oily surfaces on the feast before her. Twilight moaned involuntarily. It's time to feed, Twilight. Without another thought, she dove forward, practically falling into the floor cushions surrounding the table. With manners that would have given Rarity a murderism, and there she was not at a picnic table outside. Twilight had scattered the silverware onto the floor as she seized the nearest plate and sank her teeth into a massive buttered roll. Her teeth broke the tender, their thin skin, pulling out rich fibers of warm, steamy crumb with audible tearing. Grapes burst, tender flower petals were mints. She had set to work with the butternut squash, and with a vengeance. Her mind was blank, racked with the same sensations of taste and texture, flooding her mouth, drowning out the little odd notes that appeared in the food. Here the squash had something oddly crunchy, a stray seed, no doubt there, and the skin of the potato was oddly tough, and the dust was still coated. It felt strangely long and tickly, forcing her to rend up and rip it almost violently with her teeth. Twilight tore through the table, like she was full to bursting, pulling plates towards herself as if her legs were scoops. She groaned, wondering if this was how Spike always felt, if he always felt this hungry at times, as he claimed, and if she was maybe too harsh on him for his lack of manners. She was certain that she would appall these fangs of apples if they came to her and saw her going at it like this. She was grateful that she had been left alone for so long. She had been left alone for quite some time. She realized the sun had disappeared outside and the light only came in from the oil lamps on the table. The rest of the kitchen was draped in shadows. She had imagined that soon it would be time for bed. She couldn't remember the last time she had eaten so much. Why am I so hungry anyway? She wondered. It's hard work, Applejack's voice said from somewhere behind her. Tending the field. The gust of hot, rattling wind tore through the room on the tail of the last word, shaking the timbers of the room. The lamps around the table trembled, and the flames in their hurricane glasses scuttered and vanished before Twilight could even blink. Twilight had choked and coughed, spitting out the glob of food that had suddenly turned to soft and sour in her mouth. Applejack? She asked, looking wildly around her. There was still a light of a number of pale, dim shaft cuts through the slats of the cell ceiling and the white cast. Dusty lines across the room, but they revealed nothing. Twilight backed away until she hit the wall, yelping in surprise at the sudden thump. Her heart beating against her ribs, sending a heavy, repetitive thud throughout the room. When no answer came and nothing moved around her, she took a long, slow breath, concentrated, and launched a single mote of purple light from her horn. The room appeared before her stark shards and monochrome splintered by black shadows. She was in a room of plain, unfurnished timbers that had shrunk and splintered over the centuries of wear. The floor was hard-packed with dirt, and fixtures, cabinets, and appliances of the kitchen were nowhere to be seen. It was more like the corner of the barn that had been long abandoned than the home Twilight knew she had just been inside. Twilight's eyes fell onto the table, still present with the center of the room, pulled from the inky blackness as moat drifted over it. It was piled high with mounds of dark, shapeless matter, and lumpy protuberances rose at the odd angles throughout. She stepped closer, struggling to see it clearly with the weak light, as steadily as thud as continued to beat inside her, above her and all around her. Then her jaw dropped, and her eyes flew wide in horror. The table was piled with earth and heap of black, spongy soil, glistening with the moisture that overflowed in slow clumps and trickles over the edges. For a moment she thought it was all this. When she saw the limbs, long withered legs of every shape and size were visible in the dirt, lying barely exposed to the air atop its surface, and scattered in broken and severed fragments along the edges. There were paws and claws, and all covered in shrouds of gray and black skin, pulled tight with ruin. Farther in were the glistening cavities of the ribs enclosed with the straining matter of softened flesh. There were teeth, broken and scattered like seeds, or implanted in the mouths of half-buried of the loam, gaping wide at the half-tasted air. Something wet was seeping and trickling through the channels in the mud, spattering softly on the ground. Mold and mushrooms erupted in the damp crowns, and curtains all throughout the pale veins of their militia stretching down the clods, and bones crumbled against the slow, ceaseless advance of decay. And with the sudden crunch and the scrunch, shifting earth and dry, tearing skin, Twilight realized that the mound was not motionless at all, but alive with the glistening and scuttering of thousands and thousands of insects. She let out a revolted groan, backed away again until she collapsed, one hoof covering her mouth and another clutching her stomach. Beetles, ants, and centipedes, with all their myriad needle legs, coated the corpses and peeled and nibbled with every sharp little jaws. Some had even been killed and devoured in turn by their own kind, or by glistening, swollen-backed spiders that tickled and danced across their prey, all tumbling and all buried and emerging in turn from the black, churning soil. Twilight looked down at herself and screamed. She was covered in filth, her lips and jaw and neck and chest and caked in black mud, and the wetness of something beneath it, something black and sticky, smelling of metal and rot, something that tickled her cheek. She reached in, probing haltingly, and plucked out the white, variable shard of a little paw's bone. Her stomach churned and clenched, and she only had enough time to turn away before she vomited. She heaved over and over, mind blank except for the primal desire to rid herself of every ounce of corruption. She now felt settling lazily into her core. She sat there for some few moments, choking and sobbing between heaves until her body collapsed onto the side, her strength utterly gone. She lay there, panting, listening to the repetitive, droning thump, thump, thump that seemed to echo and pulse through the splintery wall as she lay against. Her body shook just as she managed to raise her head, every muscle feeling like the strength pulled into a breaking. Thump, thump, thump. Her thoughts were blurry again, all the nourishment expelled along with the sickness and decay. All she wanted nothing more to do was to curl up and fall into oblivion, to stop thinking and feeling, the above all, not to ruminate on what had just happened. "What is that?" she croaked, glaring at the ceiling. Could this place not even let her fade away in peace? With an explosive shattering of timbers, the ceiling at the corner caved inwards. Twilight's eyes snapped back to look at the purple light, watching as the slats sagged on the lopsided angle. With a deep, long rush, almost like a sigh, a river of dirt that flowed from the hole and began piling up into the corner of the room. Halfway across the room, just beside the table, another hole burst open, vomiting soil downwards. Another hole burst, and then another, and Twilight scrambled to her hooves, moaning just as her muscles protested and her head swam. The room swayed and turned her vision, and she fought every right to stay upright. She turned and looked at the halting creep to step towards the door. A hole opened in the ceiling directly above her head, a thin fissure that slits its way between the two slats, like a wound, swelling and peeling open. Twilight had only an instant to see the dirt tumbling down on top of her, mouth open into a strangled cry, before it slammed onto her and shoved her down the floor. Twilight's limbs tended to frail, and it was like swimming in syrup, pushing the clods and piles away with every motion. The weight grew and grew on her back, and it was all she could do to drag herself along the floor, emerging from the fresh heap like a worm and gasping for air. The emote of light flickered, swaying and darting erratically in the air as her ability to maintain, even at this most simple of magics, wavered. Another scream burst open above Twilight, sending the crushing weight sliding down on top of her exposed face. She swatted and dug with a foreleg, shoulder, screaming in pain as she dug herself free, pulling and grasping at the swelling mounds within the weak hooves as she fought to pull herself up on top of them. The light dimmed and she could only barely see the ground rising in front of her, but she could see the bones, the skin-hollowed sockets of eyes rolling and tumbling in the dirt around her. She shoved her hoof down to push herself up and let it sink into something both wet and sharp, like bones of a fish. She coughed, spewing out dirt, and lunged towards the door, trying to gain momentum to slide down and the earth towards the freedom. Another stream burst open immediately above the door, blocking the dim view of the passage beyond a cascade of black clods and white bone. Twilight floundered, feeling her back begin to sag deeper beneath the mound piling on top of it. Her legs sputtered on the brink of sparkling out altogether. With one final desperate heave, Twilight forced her head upwards, clenched her eyes, and poured the magic into the room. Lightning sparked and crackled, searing in her in its hot claws as it snaked across her skin, but the spell wouldn't take hold of her. Resounding pop filled the room with starbursts flashed around her, but nothing happened again. She poured out of her power, and again the teleportation spell cut apart the space surrounding her, but vanished to leave her exactly in the place. Why isn't it working? Twilight swam against the earth, climbing and climbing and climbing, but getting to nowhere. Darkness closed in, and her view of the door vanished as her light disappeared into the dirt. For a moment there was only the rumble and groan of the settling earth, and the roar of more crashing down from above. Then Twilight gave one last guttural cry, heaved free of the dirt in the surge of desperate strength, and threw herself through the rain of decay towards where she had thought the door would be. If she was off even by the slightest degree, she expected she would smash her skull against the wall and disappear beneath the tide. But the wall didn't come. She tripped, rolled into a slope of soft earth higher than any hill in Ponyville had ever felt, and came to the bone-battering halt as her body tumbled into the bare floor. The sound of rumbling dirt grew and muffled and subdued it as the door filled up behind her, and then settled into silence. Twilight lay panting on the floor, chest heaving. Sporadic twitches and spasms racked her body, and those drifts did in and out of coherence as the black spots swam and blinked before her. The only thing that kept her from falling into immediate oblivion was a steady thump, 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 coming from somewhere just above her. She blinked, tilting her face to try and get a sense of where she was. She didn't have the strength to even lift her head, but she tried to steady her breathing, as if the ceiling began to cave in here. She knew she would have to run again, or perhaps she wouldn't. Perhaps she would just let the place bury her and drift her into blessed silence. The ceiling did not break. She was in a dim, cavernous space that was made of the same weathered wood as the kitchen had been, but far higher and more open. It seemed to be the interior of the barn, possibly Apple's barn, or something that resembled it. She didn't know well enough to say it, but in any event this one was empty, stripped of hay, tools, or anything else familiar. It was like a coffin for dust, and dust seemed to be the only thing there, aside from Twilight. There was no sign of the bright, cozy living room she had just come through, but hardly register it to her. She could barely remember having seen that place at all, wasn't even sure she had seen it in the first place. It was like the vapors of a dream, granting her in the ghost of warmth, fading with every second. Thump, thump. Twilight turned her head sluggishly. She could see, by the light of the pale beams coming through the chinks of the walls, there was a narrow stairway leading upstairs. Bare boards on the rickety frame, nailed on the wall. It didn't even have the guardrail. It ran towards what she guessed it was the hayloft, where the rhythmic sound seemed to be coming from. Twilight whimpered, gathering her legs under herself and pushing her body slowly up. Her bandage was gone and ripped away in her struggle to escape from the kitchen. Her shoulder wept gently, sending thick and slow rivulets back down crooked paths down the mud caking her coat. But no sooner she had managed to stand than she froze as something answered her pained moan. She turned to the shadowy corner, to the place where Wanda had been, and which she thought lay empty in the darkness. Now, though she could see, it was not truly empty. It was a hunched shape, a vague quivering mass that she would have mistaken it for just another blot of darkness. A trick of her eyes, it had not begun whispering. Hooves, path, follow. She waited for her breath, trapped in her chest, to make it look like some movement towards her. Was it the scarecrow? The thing that had haunted and lured her here? It certainly seemed broken and twisted enough, but somehow she had got the sense that this couldn't be one of the monstrous figures. There was no aurora of malice emanating from it, no halting steps as it began to force its way towards her. She almost turned away and felt away. There was nothing that could be done to benefit to her. Nothing whatsoever anymore she could have gained from searching or seeking. There was nothing in this place but death and ruin now. She was certain. She would have turned and gone upstairs, if not for the quiet, miserable sob. Gritting her teeth, she held her breath and stepped hesitantly towards the thing, halting every few steps to try and determine what kind of threat it might be. All the while accompanied by the distant thump, 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 she could see the shape of it heaving, shuddering shoulders, and dark mess of what may be Maine, but little else. It wasn't until she was close enough to reach out and touch it, and she realized who she had found. Flim? She gasped, putting a hoof to her chest in horror. Or Flam? The unicorn was pale as shadow of a pony that she had ever seen. She wasn't sure if he was alive at first, as his skin hung thin, limp shrouds over his skeleton, not like the half-glimpsed corpses of the room behind her. His mane hung down below his shoulders, limp locks glistening with grease, and his face was buried beneath the wild, unkempt beard. But most of all were his eyes. He never looked at Twilight. He never seemed to be aware that she was standing there. He stared unblinkingly off into some great distance, looking up at the unseen sky, and his pupils were so small his eyes appeared almost white and blind at first. He sat on the floor, clutching his hooves around his chest, and he rocked and whispered feverishly to himself, "On the hooves on the path, follow it home. Hooves on the path, follow it home." "Flim or Flam, can you hear me?" Twilight asked tremulously. She reached out a hoof and brought a better of it, and withdrew it once more. "What happened to you?" He made no answer, muttering and shuddering. "Flim," she began again, tapping her hoof sharply against the wall. "Flam, what happened? Where's your brother?" His voice cut off mid-word and froze in place. Twilight half expected him just to kneel over on the spot, but he sat perfectly still, as though listening for something. "Flim? He's in the field," he whispered. "Him and not him. Because he stopped. He stopped talking to me. Oh, brother of mine. But he won't stop. Don't you see? He won't stop following me. Him, but not him. Out there in the field. The ones in the field." "What do you mean?" Twilight asked, taking it one step closer. "Is your brother one of them? A scarecrow out in the field?" He made no response. He turned his face in the slow arc from left to right, as though watching some cross the room. "Then we shouldn't have done it, brother. We shouldn't have fed them. We shouldn't have let them learn our taste. No way out, brother. Can't find a way out. Oh, Flim, I'm sorry. I'm so sorry." It wasn't your fault," Twilight offered, lifting her hoof towards him once more. "There wasn't anything you could have done. This place, She gasped and shrank back, snatching the back of her hoof back and clutching it to her chest. Flam's skin had started at its heat and seemed to be hot as a stovetop in the cold, dank air in the barn. It was as if he had been sitting on the hottest desert sun until that very moment. She thought that she could smell the sharp, astrid scent of burning hair. What is? She stepped carefully around Flam, trying to get a clearer view of his face. It was only there was something else in the room with them. Lying on the floor in front of Flam, practically blocked by his emaciated body, a ragged shadow, a stain of darkness on the earthen floor that Twilight at first looked to be a broad puddle, but as she gained a clearer view, the dim light from outside brought it into great clarity. She saw it was no stain, but a misshapen lump, and a mess of scraps and stringed bits dangling from sharp, juddering bones. She could see the wet glimmer of vice versa still lying at its core, and the whites of its milky, softened eyes as they stared up at her from beneath the tattered straw hat and long, spiraling horn. "I'm sorry, brother. I'm so sorry." Twilight's body heaved, but she had seen nothing more than to bring up. She pushed herself halfway to Flam, and he didn't notice her go, but he reached down and dug a skeletal hoof through the piled mess, protruding something wet and soft free with a feeble tug. Twilight turned and staggered away, but the whisper mutter of his words followed her towards the stairs. "Hooves on the path, follow it home. Hooves on the path, follow it home." She reached the steps just as the sound of a wet gurgling bite reached her ears, like the crushing of a soft rotten fruit. She fell against the wall with a nauseated grunt. Up above, steadily thumping continued. Louder now, she thought. She glanced wearily around the barn once more, searching for any alternative she could take. There was no door she could see, aside from one now filled with dirt. There were no windows or hatches, no way out. The path only led upward now. Twilight swallowed, forcing herself to take a long, shuddering breath, then turned back towards Flam. Whatever had happened to him, whatever state he was in, she just couldn't leave him. A fellow pony to languish there alone. She looked up, bracing herself to approach the foul corner once more. But Flam was gone. The corner was empty, and where the dark shadow had been in front of Flam, she could clearly see only a clean, dim spread of the dirt remained. Twilight stared at the patch for a few moments, scowling at it with little vague anger that she had the strength to hold on to. Then haltingly, she turned and began to climb. What's up, my pretties? It's the Lion Queen here. I want to appreciate you all for tuning into this video, and I do appreciate you guys supporting my video by giving this video likes and stuff. If you really enjoyed this video, be sure to leave a like, comment and subscribe if you're new, ring the bell for notifications to when I upload so that way you guys will get updated for whenever I upload. If you want to follow me on Twitter or DeviantArt, feel free to leave a follow on those if you are interested in following me on those socials. If you want to support my backup channel, known as Miss Dark Shigo, feel free to subscribe to it, as a link to that will also be in the About page section. And with that being said, and that being the case, thank you so much for watching, my pretties, and as always, stay pretty.